After its final victory over Carthage in the Third Punic War in 146 BC, the Roman Republic was enjoying a period of relative peace, having established itself as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. However, when there are not enemies abroad, enemies within will emerge. This is the story of the Servile Wars, a string of 3 slave rebellions that rocked the Republic in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, culminating in the famous gladiator revolt and last stand led by Spartacus. This video is brought to you by the Ridge Wallet. We've been using Ridge Wallets for almost a year now. They don't fold, don't budge in your pocket and are light, with a modern, sleek and industrial design. As with many people, we were using outdated wallets designed in the 90s. We moved away from large flip phones to smartphones, but why did our wallets never get the upgrade we deserve? Ridge holds up to 12 cards and has an attached money clip for cash. It comes in 30 different colors and styles, including our favorites carbon fiber and burnt titanium. For us, switching from the old wallets to Ridge was like going from an old chair to a super fancy gaming armchair. But don't take our word for it. Ridge has 45,000 5-star reviews. Each wallet comes with a lifetime warranty, and the Ridge team is so confident that you'll like it that they'll let you try it for 45 days. If you don't love it, just send it back and get a full refund. Support our channel and get 10% off today with free worldwide shipping and returns by going to ridge.com/kingsandgenerals and using the code kingsandgenerals. Though Spartacus's revolt in 73 BC is the most well known today, it was by no means the first. That honour belongs to the one which happened in Sicily 60 years earlier in 135 BC. The Romans had conquered the majority of the island at the end of the First Punic War in 241 BC. Previous conquests on the Italian peninsula had resulted in annexation, and the locals in the areas, the Socii, were granted a substantial degree of autonomy. Though contributing troops to the Republic, they were not required to pay tribute, and they were treated more as allies with Rome holding hegemonic power. Meanwhile, Sicily became the first Roman province, and so was a different case. Not only was it a mix of numerous different cultures, but it was also a place of substantial wealth thanks to its fertile lands and ideal location. As a result, the Romans imposed a new system of provincial rule over the island, with a governor being assigned and tribute collected. Although the province was under Roman rule, the Carthaginians still had substantial interest and influence there, and it would not be until after the Second Punic War in 201 BC that these last Carthaginian vestiges were forced from the island. Following the war, sympathizers of the Carthaginian cause had their land confiscated, resulting in huge swathes of land being claimed by the Republic. This fertile but cheap land attracted many investors who bought huge tracts and began establishing vast estates, precursors to latifundia. Slavery was rife, not only in Sicily but throughout the Mediterranean, and large numbers of these slaves were brought to Sicily in order to work the farms of the estates. However, conditions were poor. Many landowners did not provide enough food or clothing for the slaves, who as a result were often forced to turn to banditry and plundering to survive. Though this was a constant worry for the senators in Rome, the lands in Sicily were often held by powerful equites who had judiciary powers. Thus, whenever charges were brought against the landowners, they were simply dismissed. With the Senate effectively powerless, it was only a matter of time before such a disenfranchised group were unified and rose in revolt, something that finally happened in 135 BC. Yunus was a Syrian slave, one of many who had been brought over to the island and now lived in the city of Enna. But instead of being a labourer, he was somewhat of an entertainer. He performed magic tricks, fire-breathing, and claimed to have divine visions and messages that prophesied him becoming a king. Antigenes, Yunus's master, would often parade Yunus at dinner parties, having him perform his tricks and laughing at his claims to kingship. However, the slaves in Enna were treated particularly badly, and when they conspired to revolt in 135 BC, they turned to Yunus as their leader, inspired by his proclamations of divine favour. The revolt began when 400 of these slaves rose up in Enna, killing their masters along with their masters' wives and children, and gathering other slaves in the city to their cause. The revolt was brutal. Kangaroo courts were established and the accused tortured and executed, and Yunus ordered that all of the wealthy male citizens of Enna be hunted down and killed, save for those who could forge weapons. These the slaves themselves put into chains and forced them to work producing weapons for the rebels. Yunus proclaimed himself king and took the name Antiochus after the famous Seleucid king. Soon he was able to assemble and arm a force of 6,000 slaves, some with proper weaponry, others with more basic weapons, slings, hatchets, and rudimentary spears. Having been forced into a life of banditry by their masters, most had at least some fighting experience, and some had even been soldiers who had been enslaved as prisoners of war or bodyguards. With this force assembled, he began ravaging the countryside and gathering still more men to his cause until his army numbered some 10,000. The Romans did make attempts to quell the revolt. However, they had not fully realized the seriousness of the situation, and the small forces that they sent to deal with the rebels were quickly overcome by sheer force of numbers. Soon after this, another group of slaves on Sicily revolted, this time led by a slave and infamous brigand called Cleon. He had been a fighter since his youth in Asia Minor, and upon hearing of Yunus's success had seized upon the opportunity. The Romans initially hoped that these two factions would fight and thus destroy each other, but instead, Cleon sided with Yunus, bringing a further 5,000 men to his cause and acting as his general. Together they were able to capture the city of Acragas, whose defences had been left in disrepair. The slaves were careful to target the wealthy, mostly leaving the lower classes alone, and due to the huge economic disparity in Sicily, many of the lower class even rallied to Yunus, further swelling his numbers. After a month, a Roman praetor, Lucius Hypsaeus, was sent with 8,000 Sicilian militia to quell the revolt. Though the fact that a praetor was sent shows that the Romans were now taking the revolt more seriously, they were still not doing enough. By this time, Yunus and Cleon had 20,000 men under their command. The 8,000 militia proved no match for their more numerous and determined rivals and were quickly routed. Following this, the revolt spread even further across the island, the slaves taking numerous cities and rallying still greater numbers to their cause. 3 other praetors with similar-sized forces were also sent against the rebels, each being defeated in turn. Their success inspired revolts in other parts of the Republic, small revolts rising in both Rome itself and Greece, although both of these were quickly crushed before they could develop. In 133 BC, the revolt in Sicily was still going strong though, the slaves' numbers now growing to as many as 60,000, controlling the majority of the island's key cities and even minting their own coins. But Rome now decided to act with force, sending an army headed by the consul, Lucius Piso. Under his command, the Romans were able to make their first significant gains, recapturing Morgantina, killing 8,000 slaves in the battle and crucifying those taken as prisoners. This would act as a turning point in the Romans' fortunes. The following year, another consul, Publius Rupilius, was also sent to the island. Rupilius began a ruthless campaign to finally quell the rebellion. He first besieged the city of Tauromenium, forcing the rebels inside to resort to cannibalism. Finally, a slave called Serapion betrayed the rebels, opening the gates to the Romans. The Romans stormed the city, and the slaves, starved and in no condition to fight, put up little resistance. Rupilius ordered that all the slaves be rounded up, tortured, and then thrown off a cliff. Following this, he marched to the rebels' de facto capital of Enna, where Cleon was stationed, and once again besieged the city. Realizing that he would soon face the same fate as those at Tauromenium, Cleon decided to sally out, preferring to die in battle than starve behind the city walls. He fought bravely, but was nonetheless cut down, his body displayed by Rupilius to those still defending the city walls. The rebels' morale broke at the sight, and once again they were betrayed, with the Romans seizing the city. Eunice had not been present during the siege, but upon hearing of the death of his general and fall of Enna, he fled with 1,000 men into the mountains. By this point, the slaves knew they were defeated. Rupilius's ruthless tactics had worked in breaking the morale of the rebels, and the few who remained with Eunice knew that Rupilius would soon be marching on them next. Rather than face the brutal punishments of Rupilius, the slaves instead decided to behead each other rather than be taken alive. When Rupilius arrived in the mountains, he found Eunice with a few close friends hiding in a cave. The slave leader was dragged out and imprisoned. Though the Romans planned to torture and execute Eunice as they had with other slaves, he died of illness in prison before they could. The following year, 131, Rupilius was left in Sicily with a select group of soldiers to mop up the remnants of the revolt, but with the deaths of Cleon and Eunice, the First Servile War was over. In total, the war had cost the Romans as many as 20,000 in battle, as well as an unknown number of civilians. Although the revolt had little tangible effect on the Republic, they did become an inspiration for later slaves seeking to overthrow their masters. In 104 BC, just 30 years after the First Servile War, Sicily would once again be plunged into the chaos of a slave uprising. The Roman Republic had spent the last few years in long and difficult wars. The Jugurthine War of 112 to 106 BC, and the ongoing Cimbrian War, which started in 113 BC. Following the conclusion of the Jugurthine War, its victor and one of Rome's best generals, Gaius Marius, had been given command of the Cimbrian War. The war had already cost Rome and her allies almost 60,000 men, forcing Marius to conduct a mass recruitment campaign in order to bolster his numbers. As a result, he had asked Nicomedes III of Bithynia for soldiers. However, Nicomedes replied saying that he would be unable to do so, as the majority of Bithynians suitable for military service had been seized as slaves by Romans for not being able to pay their taxes. The Senate responded by issuing a decree that no citizen of an allied state could be held as a slave in a Roman province. This decision was made in the hopes that it would provide Marius the manpower he would need to defeat the Cimbri, but would also cost the Republic dearly. In 104 BC, Publius Licinius Nerva, the propraetor of Sicily, wanting to quickly carry out the Senate's decree in his province, immediately set around 800 slaves of allied nations free. This decision not only alienated slaves of other nations, but also angered the nobles who owned large amounts of slaves, worried that they were going to lose their workforce. Through bribes and political pressure, Nerva quickly caved to the nobles, refusing to free any more slaves and sending those that appealed back to their masters. As a result of this, 180 slaves outside of Syracuse revolted, killing their masters, taking up arms, and fortifying a hilltop location. Nerva quickly mustered together a force of soldiers and marched on the slaves. However, he did not have enough men to fully conduct a siege of their fortifications. Instead, he used loyal slaves to pretend to defect, enter the fortifications, and then betray the rebels, allowing the Romans to storm the fortifications. Some of the slaves were killed in the fighting, whilst others, fearing capture, took their own lives. Nerva disbanded his troops shortly after. However, a much larger rebellion had taken place almost simultaneously. 80 slaves had risen up and killed Publius Clonius and Equites, and, having been left to their own devices, had managed to gather 800 slaves on Mount Caprianus outside Heracleia in just 1 week. As Nerva had not been aware of this uprising, and so had not taken any action against them, rumours spread that he was a coward, and by the time Nerva did find out, the force outside Heracleia numbered almost 2,000. The propraetor quickly headed to Heracleia, but hearing of the size of the enemy force, he ordered the garrison commander of Enna, Marcus Titinius, to take 600 of his men to confront the rebels. Titinius responded quickly and marched to Mount Caprianus, drawing his men up for battle. The mountainous terrain, however, did not lend itself to the formation-focused style of battle the Romans were accustomed to. Moreover, alongside their superior numbers, Many of the slaves were armed with slings, and the higher terrain gave them a distinct advantage. The battle was short, as the Romans were quickly broken, many being killed and others abandoning their weapons and fleeing the battlefield along with Titinius. This was a great victory for the slaves. Not only were they able to collect hundreds of arms and pieces of armor from the battlefield, their triumph also inspired others to join their cause. In just a few days, their numbers swelled to over 6,000. With their numbers growing, the slaves decided to elect a king, and still inspired by Eunice, they elected a man named Salvius, who, like Eunice, was famed for his divinations and prophecies. As his predecessor had, Salvius took the name of a Seleucid king, dubbing himself Tryphon, after Diodotus Tryphon. He immediately sent his force to pillage the countryside, seeking to attack the large estates and gather more slaves to his banner. Soon he was able to amass a force of 20,000 men, and even 2,000 horses that had been taken from the estates. He now felt confident enough to attack the cities of Sicily. He marched and besieged Morgantina. Nerva had not been idle. He too had been gathering together an army, amassing 10,000 allied Italian and Sicilian troops. This force assembled, he marched to Morgantina in order to relieve the city. Salvius had not expected such a quick reaction, and had focused the majority of his forces on the siege, leaving only a handful of slaves to guard the camp. Nerva was able to quickly seize the camp, killing the guards and seizing the booty and women that Salvius had left there, before heading to confront Salvius outside Morgantina. Not wanting to be caught between Nerva's army and the city's defenders, Salvius abandoned the siege, preferring to defeat Nerva first. His army took up position on a small hill en route from Nerva's location to the city, and prepared for battle. Nerva's force soon also arrived and formed up. Salvius was quick to seize the initiative, however, charging down the hill with his cavalry flanking the Roman force. It was a disaster for Nerva. His army, being taken aback by the impetus and ferocity of the charge, and with the slave cavalry bearing down on their flank, put up little resistance. When Salvius announced across the battlefield that any man who dropped his weapons would be spared, Nerva's army broke completely, many throwing down their arms and running. Only 600 of the Italians and Sicilians had been killed in the battle, but more than 4,000 had been taken prisoner, others fleeing with Nerva. This was an astounding victory for Salvius. Not only had he won the field, but his promise to spare any man who abandoned his weapons allowed him to fully arm his army. He once again turned to besieging Morgantina. The slaves inside the city had been promised their freedom if they would assist in the defense. However, Nerva once again made a disastrous decision, announcing that no more slaves would be freed until the revolt was contained. As a result, the slaves inside the city quickly betrayed the defenders, opening the gates and allowing Salvius to capture the city. Salvius was now effectively in control of the east of Sicily. Meanwhile, in the western part of the island, yet another revolt had started. A slave called Athenion had been inspired by both the First Servile War and Salvius's uprising, and had managed to build an army of over 10,000. Athenion was a man noted for his courage, and also professed to have prophetic powers, endearing slaves to his cause as Eunice had previously. He too was crowned a king, but unlike his predecessors and Salvius, Athenion did not accept every slave who wished to revolt into his army. Instead, he picked those who had experience of warfare, whilst using the others as workers in order to keep his force well fed and supplied. By doing this, he was able to create an almost paramilitary force, with which he began besieging the city of Lilybaeum. This proved too big a task, however, as Lilybaeum was a well-fortified city, and was easily able to resist the slaves until a relief force of Mauritanian auxiliaries relieved the city, forcing Athenion to retreat. Despite this setback for the slaves, the entire island was effectively now in chaos. The wealthy Roman citizens were forced to remain in the cities for their own safety, whilst the slaves and lower-class citizens rampaged across the countryside. Amongst this chaos, Salvius strengthened his position. He gathered his force, now totaling 30,000, outside the city of Triocala, and, paralleling Eunice and Cleon, summoned Athenion. Athenion answered the summons, bringing 3,000 of his more experienced slaves with him. Possibly out of a desire to mimic Cleon, or simply intimidated by the size of Salvius's force, Athenion pledged loyalty, acting as his military advisor and general. Together they captured Triacala, once again through the help of disgruntled slaves inside, and began fortifying the city. Salvius declared the city his royal capital, established a cabinet of advisors, and even wore a purple toga with lictors preceding him, in effect making himself into the thing the Republic feared most, a Roman king. Nerva had proved himself incapable of handling the situation, and as a result, at the end of his term as praetor at the start of 103 BC, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, father of the famous Roman general of the same name, was sent to replace him. The Senate had assigned Lucullus a sizable force of 14,000 Roman and 3,000 allied soldiers. Salvius wanted to wait in Triocala and fight from the city walls, but Athenion instead advised to fight the Romans in the open, rather than risk being forced into the same disastrous situation as those in Tauromenium 30 years earlier. Salvius accepted this advice and gathered still more slaves to his banner before marching to Scythia with a force of 40,000. The slave force made camp just over a mile from the Roman camp, and the two armies began slowly closing the gap between them. Fierce skirmishes broke out between the two forces, each harassing the other with cavalry and lighter missile troops. When the two main lines met, the fighting was furious, both sides suffering heavy casualties, and neither being able to gain the upper hand. However, on the flanks, Athenion was having much more success, winning his side of the battle and threatening the Roman centre. Just as it seemed the Romans would be surrounded though, Athenion was wounded and dragged from his horse. Believing that their general had been killed, the slaves broke and fled the battlefield. Salvius was unable to stop the rout, and knowing the battle was lost, also retreated. In this rout, many slaves were cut down by the Romans, and a total of 20,000 lay dead at the end of the day. However, Lucullus had failed to pursue them any further, and the other 20,000, including Salvius, were able to retreat to Triocala. Perhaps more importantly, Athenion too was able to escape the battlefield. After being wounded, he had pretended to lie dead and had then fled during the night to Triocala. It wasn't until 9 days later that Lucullus marched on and besieged Triocala. Though the slaves were disheartened by their defeat at Scythia, they resolved to fight until the end. Lucullus attempted numerous assaults on the city, hoping to take it by force and so cut the head off the revolt. But the city's strong fortifications allowed the slaves to fend off every attempt, inflicting heavy casualties on the Romans. These victories only emboldened the slaves, and eventually Lucullus was forced to make camp outside the city, preparing for a siege. The Senate was not pleased. Seeing Lucullus's failure to capitalize on his initial victory at Scythia and his failure to take Triocala as either the result of incompetence or corruption, they decided to replace him as praetor at the end of the year with Gaius Servilius. Lucullus was enraged by this decision, seeing it as an unfair betrayal by the Senate. As a result, when Servilius landed at the start of 102 BC to take command, Lucullus ordered his army to burn their camp, supplies, and siege constructions and then disbanded them. By doing this, he hoped to humiliate his successor by making sure he would not be able to make any significant advances in the war and so dispel the charges of incompetency made against himself. The plan worked. Salvius died at some point during 102 BC of unknown causes, and Athenion succeeded him as overall leader of the revolt. Despite this setback, thanks to Lucullus's actions, Servilius was unable to coordinate a concentrated effort against him, and Athenion was able to rampage across Sicily, besieging and taking even more cities. At one point, Servilius did manage to collect a large enough force to try and face Athenion, but Athenion was able to catch the praetor's army by surprise in camp, taking the camp and forcing Servilius to retreat. Despite Lucullus's initial success the year previously, by the end of 102 BC, the revolt was as strong as ever. Lucullus and Servilius were both charged by the Senate for incompetency and were exiled as a result. In 101 BC, Gaius Marius was once again elected consul, with Manius Aquilius as his colleague. Gaius Marius was Rome's greatest general at the time, and Manius Aquilius had fought alongside him in the Cimbrian Wars and was a trusted and veteran leader. The revolt in Sicily had now got to the point of threatening a famine in Rome, thus jeopardizing the ongoing war with the Cimbri. As a result, it was decided that Aquilius be sent with a full consular army, around 20,000 men including 2,500 cavalry, most likely diverted from the Cimbrian front, to crush the revolt once and for all. Aquilius immediately forced Athenion into a pitched battle. Perhaps due to his success the year before, Athenion was confident that his army, numbering between 20 to 30,000, would again prove victorious. However, confronted by an experienced army led by a skilled and veteran general, the slaves stood little chance. The battle was short and bloody, with only 10,000 slaves managing to escape. During this battle, Aquilius and Athenion found themselves fighting each other face to face, and though Athenion was able to wound the consul, Aquilius finally killed the slave king. The remaining slaves fled leaderless to numerous strongholds and fortifications throughout Sicily. Aquilius was relentless in his pursuit. Each stronghold was besieged and the slaves inside starved into defeat. When the last stronghold of just 1,000 slaves was left, Aquilius sent envoys to them, requesting that they surrender and take their chances fighting animals in the arena. Rather than face this humiliating fate, the slaves did as their predecessors in the First Servile War had done and took their own lives, each man killing another, the last falling on his sword. Both Sicilian revolts achieved little. However, they would act as an inspiration for a much larger, terrifying and dangerous revolt, the Third Servile War under the leadership of the gladiator Spartacus. The first two Servile Wars had been focused on Sicily, where there was a huge concentration of disenfranchised slaves. However, this problem was not unique to Sicily alone, but was prevalent throughout Magna Graecia, including southern Italy. Thousands of these enslaved were put to work on latifundia, large farming estates, but many others, particularly those with military experience, were sent to gladiator schools, ludi, in order to fight in the Roman games. One of the largest gladiator schools was in Capua, and it is here that Spartacus was sent. Spartacus was a Thracian who had served as either a mercenary or auxiliary for the Roman army, before, in unknown circumstances, being imprisoned and sent to the gladiator school. Lentulus Batietes, the owner of the school, was known as a particularly cruel master, and as a result, in 73 BC, 200 of the gladiators formed a plan to try and escape. They were betrayed, but before they could be stopped, approximately 70 seized what weapons they could from the kitchens, choppers, knives and spits, and fought their way out of the school. As they escaped, they managed to steal gladiatorial arms and armor. Thus equipped, they took up a defensive position outside of Capua, preparing to face the small force Batietes had sent to recapture them. Here they nominated Spartacus as their leader, and two Gauls, Crixus and Oenomaus, as his lieutenants. Together, these three led the gladiators in the defense, easily fighting off Batietes' men and taking as much of their weapons and armor as possible. With this immediate threat handled, the gladiators proceeded to plunder the countryside around Capua, attacking estates in the area and gathering more and more former slaves to their cause, swelling their numbers to perhaps a few thousand. They equipped as many of them with the captured arms as they could before retreating to a highly defensible position on Mount Vesuvius. As the revolt was happening in Campania, close to Rome itself, and with many lands in the area being owned by influential politicians, the Senate acted faster than they had in the previous Servile Wars. However, they were still seeing the event not as a full-blown revolt or start of a war, but more as a collection of simple bandits. As a result, when they took action, they only sent a praetor, Gaius Claudius Glaber, with 3,000 hastily assembled militia, as opposed to professional legionaries. Glaber was hesitant to attack a trained force in such a well-defended position, and so instead opted to block the only passage up the mountain, hoping to force Spartacus into surrendering. But the latter proved himself a cunning leader. Using the vines and trees in the area, Spartacus's force made long ladders and ropes, allowing them to climb down the steep sides of the mountain without being noticed. Quickly, they marched around the base of the mountain and fell upon Glaber's men from behind. Taken completely by surprise, Glaber's force was almost totally destroyed. Following this victory, even more flocked to Spartacus. He was a popular leader, providing as many of them as he could with captured weapons and dividing the spoils of war equally among his force. A second force, possibly a full legion under the praetor Publius Varinius, was also sent against Spartacus. However, for some reason, Varinius had decided to split his force between two legates, Furius and Cosinius. Furius's force of 2,000 was forced to give battle and was quickly defeated, while Cosinius, leading his men to reinforce Furius, was caught encamped by a river and slaughtered, with the praetor only just escaping with his life. After these successes, Spartacus's numbers grew to almost 70,000, with the captured Roman camps providing still more equipment for his growing army. With his force now considerably larger, Spartacus felt confident enough to spend the remainder of the year raiding southern Italy, including Nola, Lucaria, Thurii, and Metapontum. These towns did try and put up some resistance, and in one of the raids, Oenomaus was killed, but Spartacus's force was so large and still growing that it would be effectively unstoppable, save for with a consular army. Alarmed by Spartacus's success against the praetors and his proximity to Rome, the Senate did indeed decide to send both their consuls, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Lentulus Claudianus, with consular armies, 20,000 men each, to handle what the Romans finally realized was a large and organized revolt. The fact that both the consuls were sent against Spartacus shows just how fearful the Senate was of Spartacus. Even at the very height of the previous servile wars, only one consul had been sent. At the start of 72 BC, these two armies set out to finally crush the uprising. The events of this year are vague and not well documented, but there seems to have been some division between Crixus and Spartacus. Crixus appears to have wanted to remain in southern Italy, raiding the country and hopefully gathering more men to the cause, while Spartacus was intent to push north, possibly through Cisalpine Gaul to freedom. As a result, the army became split, with 30,000 staying with Crixus in the south, the rest, possibly 60,000, heading north with Spartacus. This divide would prove to be the first major setback for the former slaves. Publicola was able to catch Crixus's army and forced it to give battle near Mount Garganus. They had proved themselves a formidable force, but without the leadership of Spartacus, a consular army was too much for Crixus to handle. Though he and his men fought hard and bravely, they were destroyed by the Romans, with 20,000, including Crixus, losing their lives, and the remainder fleeing to the countryside. Spartacus continued his march north, but his road was blocked by Claudianus. Publicola, following his victory over Crixus, was quickly marching north as well, hoping to catch Spartacus between their two armies. Spartacus knew that being caught between two consular armies on either side would spell disaster, and so determined to defeat them in detail. First, he turned his attention to the most immediate threat, Claudianus. Despite having a full consular army, it seems Claudianus had underestimated just how many men Spartacus would have with him, probably assuming that his numbers would be similar to Crixus. Rather than delaying until Publicola could assist him, Claudianus gave battle, and a combination of numbers and Spartacus's leadership resulted in a comprehensive victory for the rebel troops. Capitalizing on this victory, Spartacus quickly marched to face Publicola before word of his colleague's defeat could reach him. Publicola too was quickly defeated, both consular armies retreating to Rome to regroup. In a desperate attempt to regain some honor and avoid public disgrace, the two consuls tried to combine the remnants of their two forces to face Spartacus again in Picenum, but were once again defeated. Spartacus's victory over 2 consuls brought even more followers to his banner, giving him perhaps as many as 120,000, including civilians. He briefly considered marching on Rome itself, but quickly realized that, despite his numbers, his army did not have the engineering skills needed to take a city with such formidable defenses. Instead, not wishing to be caught in winter in the north of Italy, Spartacus again headed south, spending the winter raiding the country and trading plunder with merchants in exchange for even more weapons and armor. It was now the 3rd year of the war. So far, despite a few setbacks, Spartacus had the best of the fighting, defeating praetors and consuls in the field. As a result, when the elections for the praetorship came around, few candidates could be found, most fearing being forced to face Spartacus. However, one man, Marcus Licinius Crassus, seized upon the opportunity. Crassus was one of the wealthiest men in Rome and had been steadily climbing the cursus honorum. Crassus was no stranger to warfare, having served admirably as one of Sulla's commanders during the civil war in 82 BC. But he knew that to progress to the highest rank of consul, he needed to secure himself a notable military victory personally. As a result, he volunteered himself for the praetorship, even offering his own wealth to help fund the war effort. He was quickly given full command of the war and assigned 6 new legions, as well as the remnants of Publicola's and Claudianus's armies, a total of around 30 to 50,000 legionaries plus auxiliaries. Crassus's first order of business was to instill discipline in his men. The legions had performed poorly thus far against Spartacus, breaking quickly and shaming the Republic. Crassus understood that this was not due to a lack of training, but due to the soldiers' fear of Spartacus himself, and so Crassus decided to make his men fear him even more. Upon taking command of the 2 consular armies that had been defeated so soundly by Spartacus, Crassus ordered they be decimated. They were divided into groups of 10, drew lots, and were then forced to kill 1 out of the 10, the one that had drawn the short straw. This was an ancient form of discipline in the Roman army, but had the desired effect of making Crassus's troops fear him even more than the enemy. Crassus next sent 2 legions under the command of one of his legates, Mummius, to march behind Spartacus's army in order to cut off its retreat and to scout their army, giving him strict orders not to engage. However, Mummius, perhaps wanting to win glory for himself, disobeyed this order and attacked Spartacus from behind. Once again though, the legions were routed, and Mummius was forced to return to Crassus. Crassus was furious at Mummius for his insubordination and at the legions for routing. Once again he gathered the 500 who had initially led the rout and decimated them in front of the rest of his army. Following this, Crassus moved his entire force to face Spartacus. Despite Spartacus's successes, he was nervous about facing Crassus's 8 legions with his roughly 70,000 men. Instead, Spartacus decided to withdraw to Lucania in southern Italy. Whilst here, he attempted to negotiate passage with some pirates to Sicily, hoping to leave some of his army there to stir up another rebellion and bring reinforcements. However, despite taking the payment, the pirates betrayed Spartacus and abandoned him. This gave Crassus enough time to catch up to Spartacus near Rhegium. Utilizing his army's size and skill, Crassus began construction of a palisade and ditch across the isthmus, 37 miles long. Spartacus's force kept harassing the workers, but that had little effect, and Spartacus was still apprehensive about facing Crassus's full force head-on. The fortifications were soon complete. Spartacus found himself trapped and running short on provisions. With Crassus's army stretched across the line, Spartacus tried to focus on one point to force a way through, but the Roman fortifications held, and 6,000 of Spartacus's men were killed. Assaulting the fortified legions seemed hopeless. Fortunately for Spartacus, however, a fierce snowstorm blew in one night, hampering visibility. Seizing the opportunity, Spartacus again focused his army on one point in the line, filling the Roman ditch and overrunning the palisade, slipping away with 50,000 men into Lucania and trying to push to Brundisium. The Senate became nervous upon hearing this, fearing that Spartacus had outmaneuvered Crassus and would march on Rome. As a result, they sent Pompey the Great, who had recently returned from fighting another revolt in Spain, south to assist Crassus. Furthermore, they also requested Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus, brother of the more famous Lucius Licinius Lucullus, bring reinforcements from his governorship in Macedonia to help. However, Crassus was far from finished. Approximately 20,000, led by Canicus and Castus, were still trapped by the Roman fortifications, and Crassus was determined to finish them off first. Crassus approached them cautiously, sending 2 legates and 6,000 men to stealthily seize some high ground behind their camp. However, they were spotted by locals who rushed to inform Canicus and Castus of their position. The former slaves quickly fell upon the Romans, their superior numbers allowing them to almost completely encircle the legionaries. The fighting was brutal, the Romans desperately trying to buy time for Crassus's main force to arrive, their foes equally desperate to cut a way through before being encircled. Fortunately for the Romans, Crassus had moved fast, and his main force soon arrived. It was now Canicus and Castus who were encircled. Their warriors fought back fiercely, trying to cut a way out of the encirclement, but despite their bravery, they stood no chance, assailed from all sides. When the fighting was over, 12,000 former slaves were dead. With this force neutralized, Crassus now turned his attention to Spartacus, following his army to Brundisium. There were minor skirmishes as the two forces marched, Crassus picking off small groups who tried to break away from Spartacus and forge their own escape, and Spartacus routing Crassus's scout cavalry. However, just as Spartacus's army was about to reach Brundisium, they heard that Lucullus had landed in the area with reinforcements. Spartacus desperately tried to make a truce with Crassus, but was scornfully rejected. Instead, he started marching his army north through Campania to try and escape, but once again he got word of Pompey's army from the north. This proved to be the final straw. For 3 years now, Spartacus and his men had fought as free men, and they had no desire to return to being slaves. But now, with 3 armies closing in from all sides, escape and so freedom seemed impossible. Spartacus and his men instead marched south, back to Lucania, to face Crassus. However, Crassus did not want Pompey or Lucullus claiming his glory, and so had been keeping close to his enemy, and the two met at the Salarius River in Campania, where Spartacus and his remaining troops would make their last stand. The forces were roughly evenly matched, Spartacus with 50,000 remaining fighters, and Crassus with 40,000, including a few thousand cavalry. Before the battle began, Spartacus killed his own horse, proclaiming that if he won the day, he would have plenty of other horses to choose from, and if he lost, that he would not need one. His point was clear: retreat would not be an option. Spartacus would fight to the death. Spartacus's army charged the Roman ranks, crashing into the Maniple's walls of shields. Despite the majority of Spartacus's army being slaves originally, they had been trained by Spartacus's gladiator followers, armed with plundered Roman weapons, and had 3 years of experience fighting legionaries. The battle was long and bloody, neither side being able to make decisive headway. Spartacus, seeing Crassus on a horse behind the front ranks, desperately tried to fight through to his enemy, cutting down 2 centurions who tried to block him, despite receiving numerous wounds. Eventually, however, the gladiator general was surrounded alone and cut down by Crassus's bodyguard. His death sent shockwaves throughout his army, and with their leader slain, they broke. Whilst the initial fighting had been brutal, the battlefield now became a slaughter. By the end, 36,000 former slaves lay dead, compared to just 1,000 Romans, the remnants fleeing to the countryside. Crassus's men quickly pursued them, capturing 6,000, all of whom he crucified along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua. Another 5,000 were taken by Pompey's forces coming from the north, again all of whom were killed, finally putting an end to the Third Servile War. Rome would never again see a slave revolt of this scale, and Spartacus would become an inspiration for others fighting for their freedom throughout history. The Third Servile War is also crucial to the history of the Roman Republic. Pompey would claim that as he had captured the last remnants of Spartacus's army, he had put the final stop to the rebellion, claiming a part of Crassus's glory. Furthermore, both generals now had not only popularity with the people for defeating what, at the time, was considered the greatest threat to Rome itself since Hannibal, but also large armies mere miles from Rome's gates. As a result, in the next year, 70 BC, both men were elected consul.